Let's talk about grieving. No one gets through this life without experiencing loss. We all experience loss. Some big, some small, but loss is a normal part of life. And it's very important that we learn how to grieve properly, because when we have unresolved grief, it causes all kind of conflict and frustration in the soul, and it hurts relationships, because unresolved grief just starts to leak out in all kind of unhealthy ways. Why do we grieve? We grieve because we're created in God's image. And if you remember back to the Concept of God Part 2 video, we talked about how Jesus is the exact representation of God's character. And we know that Jesus grieved when he was here on this earth. And we're created in God's image, therefore if God grieves, we grieve. Now I know we don't grieve exactly like God because we're fallen, he's not. But still, the idea of grieving, we grieve because he grieves. We see Jesus grieving when he joins the family when Lazarus died. We see Jesus grieving when he hears the news that his cousin John the Baptist had died. Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He knew John the Baptist was in heaven, but he didn't use that truth as a way to avoid feeling the pain of loss. So God grieves, we grieve. Grieving is both human and divine. All right, so let's look at some examples of loss. I'm going to look at two obvious ones and then two that tend to get overlooked. Obviously, a death of a loved one, coworker, friend, family member. Death is a major loss that we all end up struggling with at some point. Divorce is a big one. Some people will tell you that divorce is actually worse than death. It just really depends on the circumstances around the divorce. So those are two obvious ones. Two that tend to get overlooked is loss of job. This is a big one. When we tend to lose a job, we just want to press on, get another one. But a job is a big part of our lives. We invest a lot into our jobs. So when we lose our job for whatever reason, it's a significant loss that we need to process through properly. And another one, as we take people's histories, we discover that a lot of people lost parts of their childhood. Maybe not all their childhood, but parts of their childhood. And what that means is they had to grow up too fast. So like, you might have been in charge, you might have been an older sibling in charge of some younger ones, so you had to feel like you had to grow up and be an adult before it was time. A lot of parents, if they're in a certain kind of condition, a kid feels like they're alone, they're on their own, they have to take care of themselves, so they grow up too quick and they end up losing a part of their childhood. And that's something that really needs to go back and be grieved properly. So we could fill this whole room up with examples of losses. These are just four of the ones that I wanted to kind of bring out. Again, two obvious ones and two that usually tend to get overlooked. So when we experience loss, a lot of the same things happen in a loss as rejection. We develop a belief system, or old belief systems are kind of reinforced, and we end up having distorted beliefs about self. I'll never get over this. I'm damaged. I'm being punished. All kind of beliefs can start to be formed. Concept of God issues come into play when we experience losses. Why would God let this happen to me? Why would God cause this? All great questions that need to be talked through. They need to be brought to God. Whether you find an answer or not, they need to be processed through. But if they're not processed through in the right way, then we can get some really distorted views of God's character through loss. So belief systems are very important to go back and look at what that loss caused you to start to believe about God, about yourself, about life. When we don't go through grief properly, it's because the false self was activated. Now, if you remember what the false self is, the false self is the self that you basically created to survive childhood, all right? So something bad happens, you create this self to kind of get through it. When a loss happens, this generally gets activated pretty quick. And what that can look like when we grieve from the false self or avoid grief from the false self, the first thing that comes to mind is we get really busy. Let's say someone dies and we have to start planning a funeral. We have all kind of legal stuff to deal with. And so we just get really busy. And it's necessary things we have to do. But then we start to figure out that that busyness is actually keeping me from dealing with the loss. Another very unhealthy way that we tend to grieve from the false self or avoid grief is we end up trying to replace the loss. So instead of grieving the loss fully, we replace it. So you get a divorce, let's say, or even if it's not a marriage, it could just be like a dating situation. Instead of fully grieving the loss of that relationship, you end up dating again really quick just to try to replace it, to try to make that pain go away. So trying to replace a loss is a very common thing that we do when the false self is activated. Self-medicate is a very common unhealthy response to a loss. Alcohol, drugs, a lot of addictions begin with a loss. So we experience a major loss and we figure out, I ingest this chemical and I feel better. I don't think about it as much. I don't feel the pain as much. Next thing we know, we're addicted to whatever that substance is that we're putting in our body. These are just 3 ways. You can go back and look at the false self video, and there's other examples of how we learn how to get through life. And you may pick up on one that you've realized, yep, I avoided grief by doing that. So when we grieve from the false self, the grief becomes unresolved. So let's look at this. What does grief look like? All right. Now we've all probably heard the stages of grief. And I almost hesitate to even talk about this because I'm going to put the stages of grief up here, but I just want you to know up front, it's not as clean and neat as I'm about to make it sound. Grieving is extremely messy. There is no formula, but there are common emotions and conditions that we tend to go through when we experience loss. The first one is denial. This one is actually God's protection. When a loss is very significant, if we did not go into shock and denial, we would probably implode and not make it through that moment. We just don't want to live here. And honestly, there's not a lot of fear of people living here. That loss is going to hit them. Nobody stays in denial forever, really, when it comes to a loss. So there's really no fear of getting stuck in denial. But I did want to talk about how it is a good thing. Again, it's God's protection. And then we can experience anger because our will got blocked. We didn't want to lose what we lost, so we get angry. Depression, prolonged sadness that we can experience for over a period of time can lead to some depression. Guilt makes the least amount of sense, but it's very normal. Guilty thoughts when we're grieving can sound something like this. If I would have invited him to come to the house, he would not have died on his way to the park in a car wreck. See? That thought makes no sense. It's not logical, but it's extremely normal. Obviously, that guilt's going to be false guilt. It's not warranted. And it's very important that we have someone to talk through, not to fix it, but we actually can hear ourselves say these things out loud. Bargaining is very common. We begin to bargain with others. We begin to bargain with God to try to somehow cope with the loss, to somehow bring the loss back, or please replace the loss quickly. I'll do this if you'll do this. So we begin to try to bargain our way out of the grief. Very, very common. Acceptance. Some people stop here and say it's kind of the final stage, but really acceptance just means you've accepted the loss. We believe that there's another stage. Resolution. You kind of wake up one day and you say, this is resolved inside of me. And you just know it. You just feel it. There is no set formula on how to get here. It's not like you start checking these boxes off. You could feel guilty one day. You could feel anger for a solid week, feel guilty again for another couple of days. Next thing you know, you're back to anger and you're just bouncing around all of these. Very common, very normal. So that's the important thing to understand about when you're grieving. All of these, they're normal. They're not right, they're not wrong, they just are. It's a normal part of the grieving process. There's also no timeline to this. Nobody can tell you how long this is supposed to take. So be wary of those who tell you just need to get over it, you need to move on, you need to just press through. It really depends on a lot of things. The significance of the loss, how long the relationship was there. Personality plays a big part of it. High feelers, they're going to grieve longer than people who tend to function from logic and reason. So there is no cookie cutter way to get through a grieving process. Again, it's very messy, and yeah, you just never know how it's going to look, and you don't know how long it's going to take. It takes as long as it takes. So what we don't want to do is sprint through this, and we don't want to sit in it. The psalmist said that we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We don't sprint, we don't sit, but we walk through it at God's pace. Whatever emotions come up that day, we let ourselves fully feel them. We don't sit in them longer than we have to, and we don't try to get through it too quickly. We want to go through the grieving process in a very healthy way. Because when we get stuck, like let's say you're stuck in guilt, right? Now guilt becomes a backdrop to your life. Let's say you get stuck in depression. Now depression becomes a backdrop to your life. Again, we want to walk through all these, not sprint or sit. So when we go through the grieving process in a healthy way, we get to resolution. When we don't, the grief is stored inside of us, and now we have to go back. So what we encourage people to do is begin to make a list of all your losses, everything you've experienced, and go back and try to remember, did I grieve it fully? Did I grieve it properly? And if not, it's time to revisit these losses. You may need to start looking through some photo albums. You may need to visit a graveside. You may need to go to the parking lot of the job that you lost and just sit and linger and reminisce and remember working there. Just something that you can do to begin to remember. And then allow yourself to feel whatever it is that it's time to feel. One of the scariest prayers you can pray, but one of the most important prayers you can pray is, Father, I give you permission to let me feel any and everything that you want me to feel. Not that God needs your permission, but it opens you up and gets you in a position of being surrendered to the Holy Spirit, begin to mining this stuff up that's unresolved. So you may have to go back if you have some unresolved grief and begin to grieve. Get a counselor, talk to your pastor, get a family member, a trusted friend to journey through this with you. And once you get caught up, then the goal is to grieve in real time, to grieve in real time as it happens, to not delay it. Sometimes we do have to delay grief. Again, sometimes, there's a lot of stuff that has to be done and we may have to put it on hold, but don't put it on hold long. When you're able to grieve, start that process. So may you begin to embrace the idea that grieving is both human and divine. And may you go back and explore your unresolved grief so it can become resolved and you can live fully alive. If this video has been helpful, make sure you click that like and subscribe button. Thanks for watching.